Okay, so today's address, or video, whatever you want to call it, is just going to be an introduction. Later on, I think I'm going to have a topic for each video and see what each of the readings have to say about that topic, et cetera, et cetera. But today I'm just going to give a kind of overview of what started me on this whole thing and why I think this is important and some of the basic details. So to begin with, this show is about the work of three different individuals and what's unique about these individuals. Why have I selected them out of everybody else in history? Well, like I said in my introduction, these people are psychics. Now, what most people think of when you say psychics is somebody who gives you a horoscope reading or, takes your necklace and tells you who gave it to you or things like that. And I'm not saying those things are necessarily quackery. There are probably people that are better and worse at that kind of thing. But what I'm saying is that it appears that there are different levels to this psychic phenomenon thing. And if that was the only level, the horoscope every day to tell your vague future kind of level, if that was all there was to it, I wouldn't even be wasting my time on this. I'd be, recording music and focusing on more entertaining things. But as I looked into it, I found there is a deeper level. There's more to it than that. And I'm not talking about Uri Geller or the other psychics that could supposedly do miraculous things with telepathy and moving objects. And that stuff is all great, but it doesn't really help the rest of us. If somebody can levitate objects or themselves or break mirrors with their thoughts or whatever, that's cool. And it's cool to have evidence of that psychic phenomena can occur, or if somebody can talk to their dead grandmother or something, that's all well and good, but it's not something that really matters to most people. Now, what I've discovered is the work of these three men does matter to just about everyone, and everyone should at least know about them, whether they're going to pay any attention to them or not, in my opinion. So, what's unique about these three men? Well, I started my whole journey being exposed to Edgar Cayce. And the first thing, I looked up Edgar Cayce on the web, and this guy had a website, and he said, the first thing you need to do before you do anything else is just read these two books. And he had the two biographies of Edgar Cayce, the one by Thomas Sugru and the other one by Jess Stern. And, of course, I read both of those and a bunch of other stuff following that to get me introduced. And some of you probably don't feel like reading a whole book just to find out. If you do, by all means, go and check out the book called There Is a River by Thomas Sugru. And the latest edition of that also has a really great section at the end that has a high-level overview of the entire philosophy contained in the readings and things. But it is a good introduction as to what Edgar Cayce is all about and what happened when, essentially. But I'll give you a bird's eye overview of that right here for the impatient and the video lovers in the world. So basically, Edgar Cayce was a relatively uneducated, high school educated individual from Kentucky that on the surface was nothing more than a Sunday school teacher and a photographer by profession. But the other side of his life, which was discovered when he was, I think, a teenager, was that he was able to get in touch with the other side. And what do I mean by the other side? Well, a side of reality that isn't perceptible to most of us. So when you hear about a ghost story or somebody talking to their dead aunt or something, that would consist of something occurring on the other side. Not that it's just limited to that, of course. Or the spiritual realm, whatever you want to call it. Another dimension, obviously, parallel, maybe. I won't get into it any more than that. I mean, that will be subject to future episodes. But anyway, so he was able to do that. I think the very first time was he was behaving erratically one day as a child, and his parents made him go lay down in bed. And while he was laying there, he started to prescribe a treatment for his malady. Apparently, he had fallen and hit the base of his spine, and this deep, authoritative voice was just prescribing treatments, and it was really complex and definitely not something you would expect coming out of this child. And that type of thing began to continue as people investigated it and explored it. They found that Edgar Cayce could fairly easily go into trance, and when he did, he apparently had access to a limitless fount of knowledge. And to begin with, that knowledge was used for healing. So if people had a problem, a health problem, he could give a reading, and when in that trance state, he was able to diagnose the problems with internal organs, things that would not be perceptible to anyone at the time. And his understanding of anatomy and medicine seemed to be impeccable. He was even tested by a battery of physicians at one point on his anatomical knowledge and stuff. And so he could prescribe treatments and et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of interesting aspects to his story. Right off, his dad and his buddies tried to use this to make money on betting on horse races and drilling for oil and stuff like that. And it's kind of hilarious to hear that the source of this information berating these guys for just trying to serve their own ends with the information when it was intended to be used to benefit humanity. So that was Edgar Cayce, and of course the question was this a demon speaking through this guy, or was it the devil, or what was it? And his family was deeply religious, and they were really all concerned about it, and so they asked the source of information, where does this come from? And the answer was that it came from a number of individuals. That basically there were a whole class of spiritual entities who were basically hanging out, waiting for somebody like this to show up that could act as a channel through which these spiritual entities could communicate. And in this case, because of the type of person Edgar Cayce was, that communication was limited to benevolent spiritual entities. So despite the fact that there apparently are different types of spiritual entities out there that would attempt to use somebody for their own ends, and it would be malicious or something, as opposed to that, in Cayce's case, these entities were what? Angels? In a sense, Christ, other entities similar to Christ, other souls that had been on earth and advanced on to higher levels, but still had a desire to help humanity. That was the answer, basically. And I'm not trying to claim dogmatically that any of this is true, or that that's what it in fact was. That's just what the source claimed. And I think overall, with these video podcasts, the tone I would like to take is that this is not something dogmatic that I'm preaching to you. The whole point is that the information that these sources conveyed is coherent information. It's self-consistent information. It's not a bunch of contradictory ramblings or pointless ramblings. And it's very useful and helpful information and insightful philosophically and regarding religion, regarding the human psyche and the human condition in general, and especially regarding all these unanswered questions that up to this point have been the realm of religion, basically, as to what is God? Why are we here? Does man have a soul? What are angels? What is heaven? Is there a hell? What's in the afterlife? Et cetera, et cetera. So there are answers, specific answers, consistent answers to all those kinds of questions in all three sources, and it all hangs together. If you have just a mildly open mind, and can sit back and reserve judgment until you've heard the whole story. In a lot of these cases, it always ends up turning out that what these guys have to say completely jives with each other and they're not contradicting. But more than that, what's interesting is that the manner of delivery, the manner in which the sentences are phrased and the concepts are put together is essentially identical in between a man that was working in the 1800s, a man working in the early part of the 20th century, basically the first half of the 20th century, and a man from the mid to actually latter portion of the 20th century. They all are obviously, when you get into it, coming from the same source. It's the same phraseology, the same sentence structure. If this is something just contrived and just a deception where these guys just said, ooh, let's get together and just start writing all this stuff, even if that's all it is, even if it's just another creation of bicameral, self-serving man, it doesn't really matter on a certain level because the information is still valuable, it's still self-consistent, and at the very least a springboard for scientific discovery and for introspection, for advancement on all sorts of levels. So if these guys were just humans and were never contacting anything, they were all geniuses and they were all on the same page, whether they knew of each other or not. And what they had to say was interesting and valuable. So, okay, enough preaching about that. And that's what I think is unique about those individuals, is that they apparently had access to a source of information that was reliable and concise, and it wasn't anything like what we normally associate with psychics. And it's very unfortunate, I think, that these individuals fall under the heading of psychics or channeling psychics or mediums or something because of the lump of individuals that they fall in with. And as I looked into it, it seems like throughout history there have been lots of different types of mediums, channeling mediums, of various types that connected to various types of entities to varying degrees of success. But I would say, at least from what I've investigated so far, none of these individuals who have surfaced even come close to comparing to the volume of material of enlightening, concrete, self-consistent material that came from these three men. So, without further ado, who are they? I guess I'll start in chronological order. The first individual in modern history like this to appear was Andrew Jackson Davis. And Andrew Jackson Davis grew up without much of a formal education. If I remember correctly, he had an education up through like grade school or middle school or something, which I think was not uncommon at the time. This would have been the early to mid 1800s. And as part of the, I don't know what you call it, the mesmerist or spiritualist movement that was burgeoning at that point, he was exposed to some people that were talking about trance and hypnotism and these altered states. And so I think that was a springboard for his interest, and he began to experiment with going into trance and found that he could do so quite readily. And the type of trance that he went into was, from as much as I can tell, it was identical to that experienced by Edgar Cayce and Paul Solomon. And the way it would work is there would always be another person present who would be the conductor, kind of like in the case of hypnotism. You have somebody that's the hypnotist. And this person would give the suggestion that he go into a trance state, and they would wait until the trance state got to a certain depth. And I think each of these three individuals had different ways of telling if that had happened. The most obvious of which would be that this voice begins to speak and saying, yes, we have the body, or we have the condition that you just asked about, and start to give a long discourse about it. And in Davis's case, I think they would wait until his body like twitched and convulsed, and then he began to lay perfectly still, and that was what happened with the other two as well. I believe they would go into a deep trance state where their breathing was imperceptibly shallow, and their body would get really cold, and circulation would go down to a bare minimum. It was a very deep trance state, and actually in his readings, Davis actually describes the various levels of trance and what their attributes are and what is unique about this state. So it was apparently an incredibly deep state of trance in which the operator, the other individual asking the questions, played an important role. And because that person was present, the other individual was able to essentially leave the body in spirit. And while the spirit was out gallivanting around the cosmos, the body and mind were left open as a channel for entities to communicate. And for whatever reason, Davis and his friends that were helping him conduct the readings, they decided, well, actually, I think it was the information, the source giving the information, that decided to deliver this information instead of just a series of kind of unrelated episodic readings, to deliver the information in the form of a book. So that meant that he would go into his trance once or twice a day or something, and or maybe even several times a day, and the source would just give this book, just deliver it, pick right up from where it left off the day before with the last reading, and just let her rip. And out of that came The Principles of Nature, which was Davis's first book, and from what I've read so far is by far the greatest and most stupendous. And among these three, that's unique, because Davis or Paul Solomon and Edgar Casey, they were more in terms of episodic readings, because the readings were given for various purposes, for people's health. And apparently Davis did give readings throughout his life for people's health and for medical applications, but those weren't recorded. They didn't have a stenographer sitting there and stuff. So in Davis's case, it was this book that was delivered. And one thing that I would really, really like to communicate in the case of Andrew Jackson Davis would be that this book, when you read it, isn't just a conventional book that some, relatively insightful but still with mortal limitations individual sat down and penned. This was a book that was delivered in the form of psychic readings, these channeling readings, where a different entity or group of entities was contacted, completely different from the individual, and they were actually just using him as a channel to give this book to mankind. So when you read the Principles of Nature by Davis, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's essentially a direct delivery. It's like, if you will, it's a book just given into your hands from these entities in this other dimension who have a wider view, these entities who can see more of the big picture and have lots of valuable things to say to us as far as how to improve our condition and our view on life and what we're doing in the world. So that was Davis. And Davis went on to pen several other books. And what's interesting is for the later books, he moved into a method of automatic writing. And I'm not 100% certain that the automatic writing was as clear as a channel for these sources as the original type of dictation that he gave. And I think it's important to note that the readings of Edgar Cayce and Paul Solomon, everything that's considered a valid reading, was given through just oral dictation. It wasn't a form of automatic writing or something, or intuitive perception. So I believe, at least from what I've seen so far, that there are different levels to this. And it may be safe to say that for most or all of Davis's later works after The Principles of Nature, that it's kind of a conglomeration of some deeper insights from the spiritual realm, and then maybe just his own perceptions of things. I'm not really sure. I haven't read it all, and that just seemed to be the impression I started to get as I got into The Great Harmonia, which was his next series of works. But nevertheless, still very valuable, and especially The Principles of Nature. It provides a coherent overview that is, in some ways, unlike anything you get from Cayce or Solomon, just because it's one cohesive work, and it's designed to be delivered from beginning to end as one cohesive work of art. And it's a great and powerful message, and it went through like 40 editions or something in the late 1800s and even early 1900s, and so I think it's unfortunate that it's kind of fallen out of public awareness. And yes, it's kind of dated. You get into it, and there are lots of things that only apply to people of the 1800s, and medicine is obviously, and science have advanced far beyond that at the time, but still incredibly valuable. So then we have the next individual, Edgar Cayce. Now, Cayce was able to go into this type of trance state, and in fact, they basically stumbled on it. You know, they weren't looking for it. He wasn't looking for it. He was a devout Presbyterian who read the Bible through hundreds of times and may have even memorized the whole thing or something. I don't know. Just very devout Christian Protestant. So he wasn't looking to become a psychic, but apparently the ability came so readily to him that it was inevitable that they discovered it, his family and associates. So early on, aside from a few readings for himself and things, Cayce's talent was just basically only used for the personal gain of his father and his friends. And eventually Cayce kind of got out from under their thumb and grew up and went out on his own. And at that point, the work came more into line with what his character seems to have been, which is something very benevolent, and he really just wanted to help people. And at that point, the focus of the readings was almost exclusively health-related. If people had problems, they would come to Cayce for a reading, and he would give them a diagnosis and prescription for treatment that would involve various drugs, some of which were completely unknown, and he told them how to make them or get them, and treatments involving chiropractic adjustments and the work of osteopaths, and also the work of conventional doctors of the time, and holistic medicine type of approaches. And from all accounts, when these prescribed treatments were put into practice, they were very effective. At least, if not much more effective than the techniques of medicine at the time. And a lot of these things were things that were deemed incurable by modern medicine, and I think that's often the case with alternative medicine when people are given kind of a closed door from the established medical community. They'll turn to alternative medicine and things for treatment, because I guess those are the only channels left that are claiming they can do anything about it. And so there are several miraculous stories of incurable things getting cured through the Cayce readings. I guess I'm becoming kind of not very impressed by it, because it's so prevalent. You get into this kind of thing, and among all these individuals, it's very common to see that they could step way beyond the capabilities of modern medicine, even today, in the case of Paul Solomon. So Cayce gave a lot of readings. Can't remember exactly when they got into full swing. I think it was in the mid-20s, mid to later 20s, giving health readings and things on a regular basis. And then virtually until his death, he died in early 1945, and go to the end of 44, he was giving readings for people in World War II and just general health readings and all kinds of things. He was working overtime because of World War II, and they think that's what killed him. Because apparently going into this trance state was kind of exhausting for the body, and it took time for a person to recover. They could only give readings for a certain amount of time per day. So Casey gave, I think from a certain perspective, I think it's safe to say, far and away the most readings. 14,000 and plus readings were given in total over that entire period of 20 years or more. And they're safely categorized and distributed by the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which has a nice website, and you can get the readings on CD-ROM or access them on the web if you're like a subscribing member. I think it only costs like $40 a year or something. And the ARE has just hundreds and hundreds of books relating to Casey's readings and spirituality and things. And when he was alive, Casey started the Search for God groups, which were groups of people trying to advance themselves spiritually and under the guidance of the readings. And there were a whole series of readings in a book called The Search for God, and then another series of readings tacked on at the end of that are given for those groups. As that in itself is a whole kind of phenomenon, because those Search for God groups are still going all over the nation. There's ARE centers and Casey groups, and it's still kind of an underground thing, but a very well-established phenomenon, and the organization seems to be fairly stable. And they've been conducting scientific research and different types of things, and holding conferences and just all sorts of stuff. You can just check out their site, and it's nice and healthy. And for the longest time, that's all I thought there ever was, because I didn't know about Andrew Jackson Davis or Paul Solomon. And I think, by and large, if people do know about channeling psychics, they know about Edgar Casey. He's probably the most popular. But definitely worth getting to know. At the very least, I would encourage you to read his biography. Because if you acquire proof, and if you're a reasoning individual, you probably definitely do, and you should. That was enough for me. And if you need more, just go to the area, talk to people, interview people, look for signs of deception or the true source of these writings or anything. Anything it takes to satisfy yourself. And I think, like I said before, the information is so important. It's definitely worth looking into. And so the last individual, Paul Solomon. And Paul Solomon I just discovered like 6 months ago or something, not even 9 months ago. I believe it was back in April or something like that. But other people have known about him longer than that. He was... Oh, by the way, I should give you dates for each of these. I wrote them down. Andrew Jackson Davis was alive from 1877, or no, I'm sorry, from 1811, or no. Okay. Sorry, I just kind of like crammed all these numbers together and I'm not looking at the right place. Andrew Jackson Davis, born in 1826, died in 1910, giving readings from approximately 1844 to 1878 and perhaps later. Edgar Casey was born in 1877. He died in 1945, and he gave readings from approximately 1920 and up through 1944. And finally, Paul Solomon, who we're talking about now. He was born in 1939, died in 1994, and he gave readings from 1972 through 1993. Okay, so Paul Solomon, again, very devout Christian, and again with just oozing over with psychic predispositions that kind of disturbed his family and led to a fairly traumatic childhood because he was a really conservative Southern Baptist. That was his family. His dad, I think, was a Southern Baptist minister. And the story of his readings didn't really begin until he had kind of fallen away from religion through several traumatic experiences and was kind of disillusioned with life and began to experiment with hypnotism. He was trained as a hypnotist in the Army, apparently, but didn't really use it on himself until these traumatic events. And somebody he was talking to encouraged him to try it, and so they try some hypnotism on him, and boom, he goes into this completely deep trance state, and the source, again, starts communicating. 1972, Casey's been dead for almost 30 years, and once again, the source is communicating, and for someone who was familiar with Casey for a long time and thought he was the only one that was ever going to happen, it's just stupendous to read those first readings, and immediately, of course, you recognize that it's the same. It is the same source. It's the same depth, the same style, the same powerful information. So, interestingly, one of the first things the readings tell the guys is that, hey, look up Edgar Casey, look up the ARE, look up the Search for God books. And these guys, they had no clue what the Search for God was, never heard of Edgar Casey. And so they found out, and that was their introduction to Edgar Casey, was through this same type of trance, through the source, the same source that communicated through Casey. And so they looked it up and found out all about the ARE and everything. And I hear they even sent a letter to Hugh and Casey and the ARE just completely ignored them. I remember reading about some other guy that went to the ARE and asked them if there were any psychics that they recommended now that Edgar Casey was dead. And the guys at the ARE said, "Oh, we don't recommend getting information from psychics." And the guy just looked at them stupended. He's like, "What? Edgar Casey was a psychic. What are you talking about?" But that seems to be the approach of the ARE, and I assume that, I suppose, I guess, in a way it's inevitable. When you get a large and established organization founded on the work of one man, especially as miraculous as it was, it's very easy for it to become closed and focused on that one individual, and for the whole thing to kind of turn into hero worship and religion, such as happened with Christ, I guess, 2,000 years earlier. The saga continues. But anyway, so ignored by the ARE and all of Casey's followers, nevertheless, the source continued to communicate through Paul Solomon. And oh boy, did it ever communicate. I think by the end of his life, Paul Solomon had given over 9,000 readings. And for various reasons, they're only now beginning to be published. The first volume just came out of his readings, and they're only readings from like the last 9 months, or, well, before I say something stupid, let me get the exact dates. This is the book, by the way. This is volume 1 of Paul Solomon's readings. But right now, at least last I checked, you couldn't get it on Amazon or anything. You have to get it straight from the website of the Paul Solomon Foundation. It's just paulsolomon.com. And so these readings were given from May 28th of 92 to December 15th of 93. And they're in reverse order. They start from the last one and work their way back. That's the way they decided to do these. Probably not too unfortunate, since the most recent stuff should be the most pertinent to us. But what I thought was stupendous was the fact that there's 700 pages in this volume, and it's only, let's see, May of 92, so it's about 1.5 years worth of readings. And from what I hear, volume 2 is only going to be about 6 months worth, if I'm not mistaken, and it's going to be of equivalent size. Only about 80 readings or so. And he gave 9,000. So if you do the math, there's going to have to be like 100 volumes or something, or at least over 50 to get all the works out there. And that's something that didn't really happen with Casey. They do have, they say, all or most of his readings printed, and I bought them. but they're organized by topic, and you usually get portions of readings under each topic, and you never really know if you got the whole thing, and you always get the readings out of context. And it's nice with Paul Solomon to have them just one after the other, the entire readings, whatever it's about, that's what's written. And maybe it takes a while longer to slough through it, but for individuals like me who want it all and want the whole picture, I think it'd be nice someday if the same was done with Casey's readings. But since the Casey readings are available on CD-ROM and online, you can still do that. You just search for them by date, search for them by year, and by month, whatever, and you can plow through them all. Another thing that's nice about the Casey readings is they're numbered by individual, so you can follow the readings given for an individual. Morton Blumenthal, I believe was his name, was a guy that got lots of readings from Casey on just various scientific and metaphysical questions, and they're really fascinating, and you can find out what his number is and go look up all those readings, for instance, and things. But they're not doing that with the Paul Solomon ones. They're just kind of organized by number in terms of sequentially what reading was it. But still, it's all there, and it's incredibly valuable. Also, the Paul Solomon Foundation has a number of his readings online, and there are even some sound recordings on a couple sites they link to of a few of his readings. That to me, that's the real incredible thing with Paul Solomon, is that they actually, from day one, they got a decent tape recorder and they recorded everything, and they pretty much got it all on cassette, and they're busy transferring those to digital formats, so they're not lost. And hopefully someday we'll get most, if not all, of those available as audio files. Fascinating to just sit down and listen to the source directly communicate through Paul Solomon while he's in trance. And it would have been incredible to have such a thing for Casey. If I remember correctly, there's only one sound recording they got of Casey giving a reading, and it's kind of rough and hard to listen to. But anyway, so Paul Solomon. The Paul Solomon readings are, for whatever reason, maybe it's just because they're closer to our time, but that's not all of it. For whatever reason, they're much easier to read. They're very clear, very direct communication, without a lot of the ambiguities and things. With Casey, it seems, and the source said that it was difficult to communicate, just depending on who was around or whatever the psychic weather was or whatever, if not downright impossible. And from the perspective of Davis would indicate that there were different levels of trance, and at some of the higher levels, you really would just tap into the higher mind of the person giving the reading, the operator. And so you'd really just have their limited perspective, and it was their subconscious, essentially, and all the information they had accumulated, and you'd be getting their opinions on the matter instead of the kind of definitive answer from this group of individuals that were highly advanced and reading from these Akashic records. There's this infallible recorded history of everything in the universe, supposedly. And so a lot of times through Casey, they'll ask a question, and on the worst days, they would ask a question, and he would just repeat the question back at them and things. And it's pretty obvious that they weren't really connecting, and sometimes the language is really ambiguous and repetitive with the Casey readings, and hard to plow through. And part of it probably had to do with Edgar Casey's maybe limited vocabulary at the time, or kind of colloquial vocabulary, and his literary knowledge was really focused on the King James Bible, and he was completely, in waking life, completely steeped in that, and so the verbal patterns you see in the readings of Casey are almost straight up colloquial King James expressions, and I think that turns a lot of people off, because they feel like, some Bible bangers just spouting stuff at them, just all variations on the same old song. And so it takes a little more effort to read through the Casey readings in their raw form, and a lot of times, most of the time. But with Paul Solomon, that's not the case. With Paul Solomon, it reminds you more of the Principles of Nature by Davis. They're so clear and so direct and straightforward and insightful and pertinent. They're modern, given in modern times. I mean, he's talking about people discovering cuprate superconductors in like 1986 in a reading. And sure enough, you'll look it up, and that was just when it was discovered. And that's kind of like Casey uncannily predicting that something similar to these rays that were used by the ancient Atlanteans would be rediscovered in 1958, and he would give it the year, and God knows how they would be able to project a specific year. And in that case, he was right. You go back and look at the history of the laser, and that was the year the guys at Bell Labs discovered the maser, which later became termed the laser, and the whole process was discovered. It was in 1957, published 1958. Just incredible. In my personal research, that's what I am working with, is lasers, so it's a pet issue of mine. And here in Paul Solomon, I'm talking about cuprate superconductors and a whole host of other things, but that was supposed to be relevant because it was supposed to be about the closest we had gotten at that point in 1987 to discovering how to tap into the limitless energy that we're all bathed in. Sound like science fiction? Possibly, but that's what you get when you read these things. It's incredible. It's stupendous. Paul Solomon is sitting there telling you, reading after reading, that the technologies and science discovered by man, they all fight themselves. To get something, you have to destroy something. It's like the basic laws of thermodynamics. You can never win. You can only get less energy out of a system than there was put into it initially, or something. Paul Solomon is claiming that that's only because bicameral left brain, right brain man thinks that way. We project that onto reality, that our mind fights itself. If you read The Inner Game of Tennis by Timothy Gallwey, that's what it's all about. How as athletes, we always fight ourselves and get in our own way. And if we can get out of our own way, we can get in the zone and perform like Michael Jordan and things. And that seems to be essentially the characteristic of man. The fall, so to speak, in the Garden of Eden, according to Davis, was this fall into this state where we deceive each other and ourselves and argue with ourselves and fight ourselves and have a bicameral brain that's divided into two halves. And this future self of mankind is supposed to be when those two halves are united again, and we only think with one mind, and we see things clearly as our higher mind speaks through us. Now I'm just rambling. Actually, that's what these are going to be. Okay, this video podcast is not going to be so organized. It's going to be me rambling about my insights from steeping myself in the works of these guys for years, especially in Davis and Paul Solomon. My gosh, that's what I've been doing for the last 6 months plus, is just reading and reading and reading all this stuff. I just can't stop. It's just crazy. But yeah, the Paul Solomon readings are pertinent to our times. He has lots of things to say about future events. Future events, and not necessarily in the terms of psychic predictions like you would first think. Future events in terms of, if a ball is rolling down a hill and there's a group of people at the bottom of the hill and the ball's rolling towards them, this great big boulder or something, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to predict that in the fairly near future, those people are going to be hit by this boulder rolling down the hill. Is that psychic prediction? Well, not really. It's just having a little bit higher level view where you can see the boulder rolling down the hill. And that seems to be the sense in which we get a lot of these predictions from all of these sources. They are in those terms. And it's also stated that, since mankind is actively taking part, whether he knows it or not, in creating the world around them and the events around them, some guy could run up and put some logs in the way and divert the ball rolling down the hill, and it may go somewhere else. I mean, we have of course, as we know, we have the power to shape our future. You brush your teeth and you prevent your teeth from falling out. Voila, you changed the future. Uh, so, of course, any kind of prediction like that is subject to change because those events haven't happened yet. And reality is unfolding, and the present is the present. So, still, some very important insights about our not so distant future, where we're heading. Insights indicating things like global warming is really important, and it is really a sign of bigger things, and a sign that great changes are quite possibly afoot within our lifetimes, possibly farther out than that, but likely within our lifetimes. That the date 2012 may very well be an important turning point, whether or not it's obvious at that time. According to the Paul Solomon readings, 2012 is going to be a juncture where if we are at a certain point, if we've basically reached the singularity, which is this point where we're supposed to really take off. If we've reached that point before then supposedly we'll have the ability to drastically change the events that are inevitably unfolding. And if we don't reach that point at that time, then apparently we'll kind of miss the opportunity to change them, and life will go on and take a different course. So he has some very interesting things to say, and as they all do, but especially Paul Solomon because he was more recent and many more things to say about modern times. But definitely I would like to impress that it's important not to get all paranoid and caught up like with conspiracy theories like oh my god, there are UFOs or the world's going to end or all this crap. Because not that there aren't changes that are probably going to happen. As always, it wouldn't have taken a rocket scientist in the early 30s to say, hey, there's going to be another great war and it's going to affect a lot of people. And even now, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to say, hey, at some point Iran is going to develop a nuclear weapon and wreak havoc on the earth. Not that that's specifically what's prophesied or anything, but still, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to point out that kind of thing out. So it's helpful, it's useful to have a resource like this to show us how we can improve ourselves, not only to change our future in a benevolent direction, but just to change our lives. Most of us live in this rat race where we're just struggling to make it, and we're governed by fears of this or that, and as it turns out, it's really just a rat race of our own design. We think the reality is that way, that's the reality we focus on, so that's the reality we get. And Paul Solomon, with his life, he dedicated it towards providing us with a way out of the rat race. And he has several key programs or courses or methods, if you will. Probably the first that most people should know about is the self-esteem survival kit. And it's unfortunate that sounds like just another self-help course or self-help tape or CD or something. On the surface it is. And the self-esteem survival kit is just a series of written and subliminal messages that you're supposed to expose yourself to on a nightly basis and read on a daily basis. And you're basically just reprogramming your mind. And, don't get all crazy that how programming is a terrible thing. Because if you think about it, we actually program ourselves. If you're always sitting there worried about, I might lose my job, I can barely make it, I can never make ends meet. And you continually worry and worry and worry. What you're doing is you're programming yourself. You're programming yourself to think about those things and focus on those things. And because of your ability to affect the reality around you, that's the world you get. And that's the world you get stuck in. So programming is something you already do. That's something Paul Solomon really hammered home. The source really hammered home. And keep in mind, these things like the Paul Solomon's Self-Esteem Survival Kit and the others, they came straight from the source. They're not something he just consciously cooked up in waking life. Paul Solomon did give lots of seminars and things in waking life, and it's pretty obvious that, here's the delivery of a bicameral man. Not that it's bad or anything, it's just that's what it is, and it's more like the conventional things that you get from lots of different individuals that are really helpful and have insights, but they don't have the infallible veracity that you get straight from the source. But the courses, they are from that source, and they are, for everything I can tell, tremendously beneficial and crucial. So the Self-Esteem Survival Kit is about getting yourself out of the rut. Instead of programming yourself with fear and getting stuck in this vicious cycle of worry and fear, the Self-Esteem Survival Kit kind of busts you out of that and gets you focusing on health and happiness and prosperity and positivism and being constructive, just as a routine subconscious orientation. And according to the readings, it's a very foundational first step. And the next step is called, I want to say the right thing, so let me get the actual book out here. That's right. Inner Light Consciousness. I had a book like this for the Self-Esteem Survival Kit too. But Inner Light Consciousness. So this is like the next step. This is more about getting in contact with your source. And that's kind of ambiguous because these guys, all three of these individuals, contacted a source or group of sources of information. But one thing that all the readings unanimously point out is that we all have a particular specific source also within us, which is ourselves, but it's our higher self called our source, or the New Thought movement calls it our Christ. So Jesus, the Christ, as in the pattern, as in someone whose source was clearly expressing and living through him. But that's not the way it is for the rest of us. Since the fall, or maybe even before that, basically since the beginning of man as man on earth, apparently, we have always been separate from our source. And that's just because that's the nature of three-dimensional reality, according to these readings. In three-dimensional reality, we are entities that exist within that reality, made up of the matter of that reality, everything, all of the periodic elements from the periodic table, etc., based upon the laws of chemistry. And from a certain point of view, that's all we are, is these simple machines that just vanish to dust when we die, and that's it. And that's the concrete, everyday side of ourselves. That's the side that your typical atheist-type scientist would say that's all there is. And that's the observable part. And apparently that's because the nature of this place is that it's a final expression of the spiritual. So that ourselves, for example, are just a concrete three-dimensional final endpoint, a final expression of our larger self, our higher self that exists in the endless, limitless spiritual planes. And since three-dimensional reality is limited to 3 dimensions, and since we are limited to these animal organisms with a bicameral brain, in this reality, on the surface, all we are is just that. Our brain is according to these readings, is a filter or a reducer that focuses only on the concrete, only on this 3-dimensional perceptible universe. And because of that, it enables us to operate in this world exclusively. It makes this world unique in that it's isolated from everything else. And it creates a very profitable learning environment, which apparently is why we are here, basically. to learn and benefit from this isolation. But the end point is not to remain isolated forever. It's to come in contact with the rest of ourselves, the self that wouldn't fit into our head, wouldn't fit into our three-dimensional body, so to speak, which is the complete us, the much more to us that there is. And Inner Light Consciousness, the course by Paul Solomon, is essentially nothing more than a method of meditation. And if you read what Casey has to say on meditation, this is by no means the way or the only way, or even for some people the best way of contacting your source and building up a relationship with your source. But as the Paul Solomon readings put it, for many people, it's going to be a very, very effective method, step-by-step method of learning how to contact your source constructively through meditation. And you may say, can't I just do that through transcendental meditation? You know, I mean, and Zen Buddhist kind of thing. And I would say, perhaps, but the difference is, with something like transcendental meditation, you reach the necessary first stage, which is stopping thinking, just sitting down and being quiet and not stopping the endless train of conscious thought. But the next step is to be focused, is to have a focus in that state of contacting your source, your higher self. And this is really, it doesn't have to be just a religious or spiritual thing. And from a certain perspective, this is just the nature of the larger reality. We only can contact the spiritual side through our intuitive subconscious self. So we have to let that subconscious intuitive side predominate in order to connect with the rest of ourselves and let the rest of ourselves act and communicate through us. So it's not like you give yourself up to this impersonal God that's not a part of you and he kind of takes over and you lose yourself. It's more like the rest of yourself, the larger part of yourself, gets to finally communicate through you and live through you the way you really want, and which helps you, to a great degree. And according to all three sources, that is what Jesus Christ was. He was the first. He was the one that connected first. He was this example of getting in contact with our higher self and what happens when that higher self lives clearly through us without holding back. And the most unfortunate thing that happened with the story of Christianity is that we lost sight of the fact very quickly that Christ was showing us the way we could be, that we could walk in his steps and, like he said, do even greater things than he did. Unfortunately, he very early on became an object, an entity to be worshipped, someone who we could never become equal to. And I think one of the most, if not the most important message coming from all three of these sources is that is not the case. Christ was not someone just to be emulated. That he was demonstrating a pattern that we could follow to connect with ourselves and become, once again, a whole man that would live without fighting himself, and as a consequence, have all kinds of things that appear to us now just to be miraculous. Capabilities of awareness and connecting with others in the cosmos and creation and healing and all sorts of things. So I hope that would give you a first taste of what Paul Solomon has in store. It's just a whole universe. I'd encourage you to go to the Paul Solomon Foundation website, paulsolomon.com, and check him out as well. So I'll wrap that up here. We're getting to be about an hour. Next week I'll pick a topic that's more specific and try to focus on that. And I'd hope to encourage you to look these guys up. Look it up for yourselves. Read as much as you can stomach. And really get into it, because there's a lot of worthwhile things they have to communicate, and it's not just quackery, it's valuable. So thanks for your time. Until next time, carry on.